Which council do you think breaks the law the most when it comes to homelessness law? Now, if you've worked in the sector any length of time, you can probably guess it's going to be one of two councils, and that council will either be Westminster City Council or Birmingham City Council. You'd be absolutely right. I did some statistics which I'll explain a bit more in a minute, and I listed out all the different areas that had upheld decisions against them around homelessness by the LGO between April 2021 and March 2024. And as you can see from this graph, Westminster did the worst, followed by Birmingham, and then most of the following councils are all London based, which you can probably imagine as well. So out of the 309 housing authorities that I count around the country, and I might have a bit of error there because the boundaries do change fairly regularly, but out of the 309 housing authorities in the country, 104 of those local authorities appeared on this list, so 200 odd hadn't had any upheld complaints against them at all. And you can see from this graph there's a real concentration around London councils, and then you've got other areas as well which tend to be urban areas, Nottingham, Manchester, those kind of places, and also just down the southeast coast, which I guess there tends to be quite a lot of pressure on those services as well. Now, there's a lot you can probably draw from these statistics, but I do need to give a little bit of caveats to it to explain how exactly I've come up with these figures, because it's clumsy, and I realise it's clumsy. Essentially, what I've done is gone through the local government ombudsman's database on upheld complaints. Not all complaints are published because some of them will present a risk to the individuals involved in them because there might be domestic abuse or something like that. So not all decisions are published, and the upheld decisions will vary massively between relatively insignificant things like not having a personalised housing plan completed for the person, right through to outrageous gatekeeping, leaving people in harm's way, multiple failures, systemic failures, individual staff failures. And so it's kind of worth bearing in mind that although a council might feature on this list, it might actually be for something relatively insignificant, or equally it might be for something outrageous, and these statistics don't really kind of get to the number of that at all. I think if I count this correctly as well, all but one of the London councils feature on the list, and this is where for me this starts getting interesting, because you can look at these figures and you can conclude that it's the London councils, it's the kind of these councils on the list which break the law the most often. But actually I don't think that's necessarily a fair conclusion or a useful conclusion, because lots of areas in the UK don't have any legal aid funded services that kind of cover housing. And so between the Law Society and LexisNexis, I kind of looked at a couple of maps they'd done on this issue. I kind of amalgamated them a little bit and I updated them a little bit because there's been boundary changes and things like that since they were published. You can see that there are large areas of England which don't have any legal aid funded housing services. So most of East Anglia, down in the southwest, Devon and Somerset, you've got a band around what I guess is the Cotswolds and kind of Swindon, Wiltshire area, and then you've got a little band up north and a bit in Kent as well as some other ones dotted around. Now, in those areas, there is no legal aid funded service for housing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no decent advocacy services there, but legal aid funded services will be going after councils' practices around homelessness law in the way that most homelessness services simply don't. So most charities are either paid by the local authority and they won't challenge the council because they're paid by the local authority, or they just don't have that approach. They've got more of a soup run or kind of winter night beds, that sort of approach, which may or may not have some good stuff going on for it, but ultimately it does little to address systemic issues around homelessness. And as I've said elsewhere, that's the way that you end homelessness. It's got to be the systemic kind of stuff. So if you actually look at these legal aid deserts, only 14 of the 355 upheld complaints I could see on the LGO's website came from areas that were in a legal aid desert, which is crazy if you think about it. So I'm just doing the maths off the top of my head. That's something like less than 5% of decisions are coming from areas where there are no legal aid funded services. And in my own casework, when I worked at Just Us in Bedford, obviously most of the cases we dealt with were Bedford Borough Council, but we did also support people to flee abuse or kind of move elsewhere. And so I worked with maybe a couple of dozen councils. I lost count, to be honest. But most of them broke the law. And actually it was interesting that the councils that were not used to having any kind of challenge, so those councils which tended to be kind of rural or suburban areas where they had no legal aid funded services holding them to account, they would just incriminate themselves within the first couple of emails and kind of say things which obviously were going to get upheld complaints against them when it comes to the LGO. And it almost seemed like they were naive about what they were doing. Whereas if you go to somewhere like Lewisham, I had a complaint with Lewisham a long time ago, they knew exactly what they were doing and they were playing the game, and they were kind of used to that kind of back and forth. Homelessness law is supposed to be adversarial, by the way, so the local authority is supposed to give kind of their best argument and the advocate is supposed to give their best argument, and you're trying to kind of find out what the truth is in the middle of it. But where you have areas where there are no services doing that kind of work, councils get away with all sorts of things. And so the worst complaint I've seen in the last 5 or 6 years that wasn't Bedford Borough, was basically a council which failed a victim of domestic abuse really badly over many years, and literally at every stage of their service they broke the law. So it's either individual officers breaking the law, or even the system as a whole, the IT system and so on, was also causing the council to act unlawfully. So and as far as I can tell, looking at the way they dealt with the complaint, they were just not used to being complained against effectively, you know, kind of sticking on point, raising issues around legality, those kind of things, and it led to a really good outcome in that case, and it wasn't published on the LGO website because of the risk to the individual. So that's something to kind of bear in mind, is that just because a council doesn't feature on the list doesn't mean they're not breaking the law. And the other thing to say is that, say something like Bedford Borough, which we started taking on 10 years ago with Just Us, for the first couple of years we had to go all the way through the complaints process. We had to go to the LGO to get the upheld complaint, but once we'd done that a few times, we actually got to a point where the head of service would meet with us every 3 months, and we just bring a load of new cases to them, and they would settle, they would pay compensation, they would sort things out elsewhere, as opposed to going through the complaints process. So the key thing for me with all this is that a small number of people working in an area can have a massive impact. And I use Bedford as an example again. When we started working at Just Us, when we set it up, there were only 61 units of temporary accommodation in the area. Now there's over 700. I don't know how many households are in temporary accommodation now, I've kind of lost count. So it's a more than 1,000% increase. And that is partly because we raised issues, we complained about things where the council broke the law, we got people housed, we used the knowledge we gained from those cases to then inform the politicians. So we'd go and ask awkward questions in the housing committee. And that's something that a lot of solicitor firms just don't do. They'll argue the case, they'll win the case in terms of, you know, is the person in priority need? Yes, okay, job done, we'll get paid. And that doesn't change the system. And the other thing with the existing sector is, because these legal aid funded services are focused in urban areas, they are simply, you know, it ends up just being a game. They'll win an argument or they don't win an argument, they'll get paid either way. And the council won't change, because, you know, if you go and challenge Westminster City Council, what do you think they're going to do? They just don't have the land or have the resources to build more social housing in a way that other areas could do. So I would say, you know, if you look at these figures and take them together, that if you were to challenge those areas which are not used to getting challenged, so those red areas on the map, you know, where there are zero funded, legal aid funded services, go after those councils, get people housed, make sure the council's following the law around the basics around making homeless applications, accepting homeless applications, placing people in temporary accommodation, all those kind of things. If you start doing that, you're going to find that those are the councils which can actually have dramatic increases. So going back to Bedford, it was in the paper last week, they employed 22 more housing officers, partly on the basis of the work we'd been doing in Bedford. You know, we raised the fact that caseloads around housing officers was just getting ridiculous a couple of years ago, and it takes a while to actually kind of work itself out. But it seems that our work that we did at Just Us, and Just Us continues to do in Bedford with John and Katie, the work they're doing, the work we did, had a massive impact, and you know, it kind of then leads to further problems, you know, housing supply in general. But local authorities have far more power around house building than you might realise. Central government obviously has a lot of power, and there are some national organisations like Shelter or whatever who lobby for things around central government. But actually local government get away with a lot of stuff where if there were local, you know, kind of local members of the public who were committed to doing this sort of stuff, and they took upon themselves to take the council to and hold them to account, you're going to find that actually you're going to get those, you know, dramatic improvements, because it's local councils that set how much affordable housing is built, how much accessible housing is built, all that kind of stuff. And if organisations around the country were each doing it with their local authority, we're actually going to see a lot of improvements that you're not going to get elsewhere. So I think, so, you know, as I say, that's how I'd kind of look at these figures. You know, it's interesting to see which councils feature on the list, but it's also interesting to see which councils don't, and just kind of how that correlates with services that are taking their council to account. And I realise there are going to be some services which are not legal aid funded, which do a great job of holding their council to account. So Just Us is one of them. You know, Just Us is not funded by legal aid. There is no legal aid funded services in Bedford, but the impact that we were able to have with a small number of people was quite dramatic, really, and required relatively little effort if you think about how much effort is expended on homelessness around the country. So yeah, I'm hoping this is useful. It's not just about kind of criticising Birmingham and Westminster, although another issue here is just how a lot of these councils almost seem like they've given up. That's how I'd kind of interpret it. They've kind of reached that point where they're like shrugging and saying, well, there's nothing else we can do. and the way housing law has been treated by the sector in general means that it's really been undermined and it doesn't hold the power it should do. You know, it should matter that a council's breaking the law in a way that it doesn't at the moment. So I think that's also something you can do, is to kind of increase the currency of law breaking by not only getting someone housed, but getting upheld complaints, getting compensation, but crucially making that political, because as we said elsewhere, the compensation that the LGO will recommend is probably less than it will cost the council to house the person in the first place. So unless you're willing to rattle a few cages and make it known to the local councillors, who won't know the first thing about homelessness really, because they're just members of the public as well, unless you're willing to take those issues to them and make them look bad if you need to, in order for them to wake up and actually start making improvements, then that's what it will take. And unless, you know, less homelessness charities around the country are willing to do that, we're going to continue with this status quo of rampant law breaking all around the country. Lots of vulnerable people being deprived their rights systematically, and all of the harms that come with that. So, as I say, I'm hoping this is useful. Got some more statistics videos to do at some point, because I found some other interesting stuff out. But for the time being, as I say, I'm hoping that's useful. If you want to ask questions about any of this, it's something we can discuss in our weekly live stream at 7:30 every Thursday, or most Thursdays. Sometimes it's Wednesday. And also, if you're interested in this kind of housing law stuff, do check out our online training. If you check out our Eventbrite link, which is in the comments section or whatever in the description, it will just say when the next open course is coming up. Very low cost, really good feedback we've had. So yeah, as I say, hopefully it'll kind of give that foundation for actually getting people housed locally and starting this journey of getting councils to follow the law all across the country, not just in those, you know, 1 or 2 areas basically.